Jack Thomas felt the cold bite of the morning air as it whipped through the barren forest, his breath crystallizing in the frost before it vanished into the emptiness. He trudged along the beaten path, each step a quiet reminder of the solitude he'd come to know over the years. The frontier had taken much from him, his family, his peace, his sanity, but it had also given him something in return, a sharp edge, honed by survival, by the need to always be one step ahead, always aware of what lurked in the distance. His boots crunched against the frozen ground, the eerie silence of the wilderness only broken by the occasional call of a distant crow. There were no other men here, no other souls to share the burden of this land. It was a place where the weak died quickly and the strong were left to carry on with their pasts, weighed down by the ghosts of those who had failed to survive. Jack had known death. He'd seen it in the faces of settlers who'd hoped to tame this land but were swallowed by it instead. He'd felt it in the grip of a rifle, the cold steel of betrayal. And most painfully, he'd tasted it when his wife, beautiful, strong, and filled with hope, was taken by a raiding band of Apaches. That memory, more than any other, had kept him alive. The rage, the guilt, the emptiness that gnawed at him every waking moment, every heartbeat. It was his constant companion, a fire that burned through his veins, pushing him forward, forcing him to move even when every muscle begged him to rest. Today was no different. Jack's hand brushed against his side, where his rifle was slung over his shoulder. He had a mission, though it wasn't one he welcomed. The letter, thick with the ink of a distant fur company, had arrived 2 weeks ago. Its contents had stirred something in him, something deeper than the call of survival. It wasn't just furs they wanted. It was information. A story, one buried deep in the heart of untamed lands, inhabited by tribes that even the fiercest settlers dared not provoke. Tribes Jack had only heard whispers about. And yet, here he was, on a journey that felt destined for disaster. The company wanted more than pelts. They wanted knowledge. Knowledge of the fearsome tribes that had all but disappeared from the history books. He'd been hired to find them, to discover what remained of their legacy. But Jack had never been a man to chase myths. He wasn't some explorer or scholar of the wilderness. He was a survivor, and the only thing that mattered to him now was his own survival. He paused at the edge of a clearing, looking out across the wild expanse. The land stretched out before him like an endless canvas, snow-capped peaks rising sharply in the distance, trees stretching tall and silent, and the great silence that came with knowing that this world was not meant for men. Not meant for him, anyway. And yet, there was the letter, burning a hole in his coat pocket. "We need someone who knows how to handle the wilds," it had said. "We need someone who's seen the worst and survived it. This is more than a hunt, Thomas. This is a story that's waiting to be told." And then it offered a sum of money that was enough to tempt any man with a fractured soul. Jack had never been one to turn down a payday, but something in the words of that letter struck a chord deep within him. He couldn't ignore it. Not this time. It was then, as the wind howled through the pines and the sun began its slow rise over the treeline, that he heard it, the sound of a twig snapping in the distance. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle. He wasn't alone. The figure emerged from the shadows of the trees, tall and lithe, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent their life in the wilderness. Jack's grip tightened, his senses on high alert. The man didn't carry a rifle. Instead, he had a bow slung across his back, and his eyes, dark and calculating, never left Jack's. There was no hesitation in the way he moved, no sign of fear. Jack stood frozen for a moment, watching him. He'd known men like this before, frontiersmen, outlaws, the kind who lived by their wits and their ability to blend into the land. But this man wasn't like any frontiersman Jack had met. His skin was darker, his features sharper, like the land itself had shaped him. And there was something in his eyes, a fire that burned with a purpose Jack couldn't understand. The silence between them stretched, neither man speaking, neither man willing to make the first move. The wind picked up, swirling around them, pushing at their clothes and faces. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and steady. "You're far from home." Jack's hand remained on his rifle. "Ain't the first time," he replied, his voice rough with the years of solitude. The man's gaze flicked to Jack's rifle, then back to his face. "You're lost," he said simply, as though it were an undeniable truth. Jack bristled. "I know where I'm going," he snapped, though there was no confidence in his words. The stranger seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You've come for the furs, haven't you?" he asked, as if the answer were already clear. Jack didn't answer. His silence was enough. The man nodded, as though he expected this. "You're not the first to come looking for them," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "And you won't be the last. But the land here, it's not what it seems. It doesn't give easily. Not to men like you." Jack frowned. "What do you mean?" The stranger's expression darkened. "The tribes you seek, they don't welcome outsiders. They don't share their land or their secrets. And those who try to take them end up forgotten." Jack took a step forward. "And you think you can stop me?" For the first time, the stranger's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "I won't stop you. I'm just telling you what's true." The air between them seemed to hum with tension, thick with the weight of unspoken understanding. Jack could feel it in his bones, the sense that this meeting wasn't random, that this man, this stranger, was somehow tied to the very land he sought to understand. The man took a slow step back, his eyes never leaving Jack's. "Come with me," he said, his voice firm, "and I will show you what the wilderness truly holds. If you're willing to learn." Jack hesitated. It was clear the man knew something Jack didn't, something critical. There was no question in his mind that the journey ahead would be far more dangerous than he could have imagined. And yet, for some reason, he felt the strange pull of destiny. The stranger turned and began walking toward the tree line without another word, his silhouette blending with the shadows, as if he were part of the land itself. Jack, his heart pounding in his chest, followed. The journey was no longer just about survival. It was about something deeper, something far more dangerous. The fire crackled in the stillness of the night, the flames casting long shadows across the dark forest. Jack sat across from a stranger whose name, Aki, had come as a whisper between the gusts of wind. There was a silence that settled between them, heavy and thick, as though the land itself held its breath. Jack stared into the fire, his thoughts swirling, as the shadows of trees loomed like silent sentinels on the edge of the camp. It was a different world out here, one Jack had never truly understood. "Tell me about the tribes," Jack said finally, breaking the stillness. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of something raw, something that hinted at desperation. Aki didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his eyes toward the fire, as if searching for something in the dancing flames. The silence stretched, and Jack began to wonder if he would ever get an answer. Finally, Aki spoke. "The tribes you seek are not what they seem." Aki's voice was low measured, his accent thick but deliberate. "They are not savages, as your people call them. They are warriors, hunters, survivors of a world that no longer exists." Jack's brow furrowed. "I don't care about their stories. I care about what's real. What's out there?" Aki's eyes flicked up to meet Jack's, and for the first time, Jack felt the weight of something ancient and powerful in those eyes. "The world you seek is hidden," Aki said, his voice heavy with a truth Jack wasn't prepared to hear. "There are places in these woods that even the bravest men avoid. And there are people, tribes, who know these places better than they know themselves." Jack shifted uncomfortably, the chill of the night creeping into his bones. The air seemed to grow colder, heavier, as though the forest was listening to Aki's words, holding its breath. Aki didn't seem to notice, his eyes lost in the flames. "The Apaches," Aki continued, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "You've heard of them. Savage, relentless. But there's more to them than stories of bloodshed. They move like ghosts through the land. They don't just fight, they vanish into the wilderness, become one with it. No man can track them, no man can catch them." Jack clenched his jaw. He had heard the stories. The raids, the scalps, the terror they brought. But he hadn't realized the depth of it. He hadn't known how deeply the Apaches were intertwined with the land itself. Aki continued, his voice growing more intense. "And the Comanches, they are the horse lords of the plains. Fast, brutal, and they know how to make war. But it's not just about the fighting. It's about the land, about controlling it. The Comanches have always known the land better than any settler. They move like the wind, striking without warning. To face them is to face your own fear. Jack's mind raced. He had come here seeking furs. He had thought that was all he needed. But the more Aki spoke, the more Jack realized that this was no ordinary journey. These tribes, these warriors, were not mere obstacles in his path. They were part of the very land he sought to conquer, part of the story that was unfolding, whether he wanted to be part of it or not. The Blackfeet, Aki said, his voice now barely audible above the crackle of the fire. They are the guardians of the northern plains. They fight to protect their sacred ground, their ancestors' spirits. The Blackfeet are relentless, and they never forget a wrong. They will track a man to the ends of the earth if they have to. Jack felt a chill run through him. He had heard the names of these tribes, had heard the whispers of their fierceness, but hearing them from Aki, hearing it as a warning, made everything feel more real. Aki paused, his eyes never leaving the fire. The flames flickered, casting strange shadows on his face, making it impossible to read his expression. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his gaze steady. There was something important here, something Aki wasn't saying. Aki finally looked up at Jack, his eyes cold and distant. These tribes, they are not just warriors. They are the last of the old ways. They understand the land in ways that you and I cannot. They see things that we cannot see. If you venture too far into their territory, you will not come back unchanged. Jack took a deep breath. The weight of Aki's words hung heavy on his chest, but he didn't flinch. He had come for answers, and Aki was offering them, even if it wasn't the kind of truth Jack had hoped to find. "I don't fear them," Jack said, his voice steady, though the words tasted like a lie. "I've fought men, beasts, and worse. I can handle this." Aki's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but more like the acknowledgement of a shared understanding. "Fear is not something you can outrun," he said. "It will find you. In the forest. In the wind. In the stories of the land. It will find you." Jack was silent for a long moment, the fire crackling between them. He knew Aki's words were more than warnings. They were a promise. The promise of something greater than any fight he had faced before. Aki leaned forward, his eyes intense. "The tribes you seek are not just men. They are a part of a land, Jack. And the land remembers." The fire popped loudly, sending a shower of sparks into the cold night air. Jack stared into the flames, trying to make sense of everything Aki had said. But it was hard to separate the stories from the reality. The land, the tribes, the fear, everything was starting to blur together in a way that made him question everything he thought he knew. "You think I don't understand?" Jack asked, his voice hardening. "I've fought in wars, faced the worst that this land has to offer. I've survived things that would have broken a lesser man." Aki regarded him for a long time, his face unreadable. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You've survived, yes. But you don't understand. Not yet." Jack's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Aki stood and gestured toward the forest. "The path ahead is long. The dangers are greater than you know. You will meet them soon enough." Jack looked toward the trees, the shadows stretching out before him like dark fingers reaching for the horizon. The air felt thick with the promise of danger, of something ancient and powerful that was waiting for him. He stood, the weight of his rifle heavy in his hands. "Then let's get moving." Aki nodded. His eyes softened, just for a moment, before the mask of the stoic warrior fell back into place. "It begins now," he said. And together, they disappeared into the dark wilderness. The forest swallowed them whole, the trees pressing close like silent sentinels, guarding secrets long forgotten. Jack's boots sank into the soft earth, each step heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Aki moved ahead of him, his figure almost ghostly in the shadows, his footsteps light and sure, as if the land itself whispered directions to him. Jack had long since learned to stop questioning the strange ease with which Aki navigated the wilds, a man whose connection to the land was so deep it seemed almost unnatural. But Jack wasn't concerned with Aki's skills. He was concerned with what lay beyond the trees. The deeper they ventured into the wilderness, the more the air seemed to change. It grew heavier, denser, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches intertwining like a tangled web, blocking out much of the daylight. The sounds of the forest became more distant, muted, as if the land was trying to keep them from hearing something, or someone. Jack's rifle was slung over his shoulder, but his hand rested on it, ready. His instincts were on high alert. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made him tense. The land felt alive, aware of their presence, as though it had been waiting for them all along. The silence stretched on, broken only by Aki's steady breathing and the occasional murmur of the wind through the trees. Jack's mind raced, a storm of thoughts swirling in the quiet. He had come for knowledge, to uncover the secrets of the tribes that had once ruled this land. But as Aki had warned him, this was no simple journey. The tribes were not just people, they were forces of nature, entwined with the land itself. And the deeper Jack went, the more he realized that the land was not simply a backdrop to their story. It was a player, a silent, watching presence that would not easily give up its secrets. Aki stopped suddenly, holding a hand up, signaling Jack to do the same. Jack froze, his body tense with anticipation. They were on the edge of a clearing, the trees thinning just enough to offer a glimpse into what lay beyond. Aki's eyes scanned the area, sharp and calculating. "They're here," Aki said, his voice a low whisper. Jack didn't ask who he meant. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the prickling sensation at the back of his neck. The land was holding its breath, and somewhere, just beyond the tree line, someone was waiting. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle as he slowly crouched down, trying to make himself as small as possible. Aki followed suit, his movements fluid, almost effortless, as if he had become part of the very wilderness itself. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their breathing and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. And then, through the trees, Jack saw them. A group of men, cloaked in furs, their faces painted with symbols Jack couldn't understand. They moved silently, their eyes scanning the forest, alert, waiting. These were no ordinary hunters. These were warriors, and their presence here was no accident. The Apaches. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he watched them. There were 5 of them, all armed with bows and arrows, their faces grim and focused. They were moving in a formation, a well-practiced pattern that spoke of years of experience. Jack felt a knot tighten in his gut. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a search. Aki's hand gripped Jack's arm, steadying him. "They're not hunting for game," he whispered. "They're hunting for us." Jack's mind raced. They were close, too close, and the clearing offered no cover. He knew that if they were spotted, they wouldn't survive the encounter. His breath came in shallow gasps as he glanced at Aki, his thoughts a blur of panic and calculation. Aki's eyes, however, were calm, the focus of a man who had lived in this world for far too long to fear it. The Apache warriors continued their slow, deliberate movements, their eyes scanning every inch of the clearing, their senses honed to a level Jack could barely comprehend. It was clear now that they weren't just looking for food or territory. They were hunting something far more dangerous. Aki turned his head, his eyes locking with Jack's. There was a moment of understanding between them, a silent agreement that spoke louder than words ever could. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Sooner or later, the Apaches would find them, and when they did, there would be no escape. "We move now," Aki said, his voice barely a whisper. Jack nodded, his mind already calculating their best course of action. Aki didn't wait for confirmation. He moved with the fluidity of water, slipping between the trees, his steps light but purposeful. Jack followed as closely as he could, every step careful, calculated. They had no time to waste. The Apaches had closed in on their position, and Jack could feel the heat of their pursuit in his blood, a rush of adrenaline that made every muscle tense, every nerve raw. They weren't just being hunted. They were being tested. The land itself seemed to conspire against them, the trees growing thicker, the underbrush more tangled, as if it were trying to slow their progress, to trap them here. Jack's breath came faster as they pushed forward, weaving through the trees. The sound of the Apache warriors' footsteps was growing louder behind them. Aki didn't look back. His focus was unshakable, his eyes locked on the path ahead. Jack struggled to keep up, the sound of their pursuers getting closer. But he couldn't help but feel the weight of something greater closing in on them. A flicker of movement caught Jack's eye, a shadow darting between the trees, swift and silent. He whirled around, raising his rifle, but Aki's hand shot out, stopping him. "Wait," Aki hissed, his voice low but urgent. Jack's grip tightened on his rifle, but he didn't pull the trigger. The shadow had disappeared, leaving only the haunting echo of its movement. Aki's eyes were narrowed, scanning the trees with a fierce intensity. "They're not alone," Aki muttered. "The Comanches." Jack's stomach sank. Comanches. The name alone was enough to send a chill down his spine. Known for their speed, their savagery, and their mastery of the plains, the Comanches were a force unlike any other. The thought of facing not one, but two enemy tribes made his blood run cold. "We're caught between them," Aki said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to move faster." Jack didn't need to be told twice. The pursuit had turned from a hunt into a race for survival. The Apaches were closing in on them, and now the Comanches were somewhere in the woods, just waiting to make their move. Jack didn't know how much longer he could keep up. His legs ached, his breath came in shallow bursts, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to. The land was closing in around them, and the tribes, fierce, merciless, and unknowable, were already on their heels. Aki's figure moved ahead, almost disappearing into the shadows of the trees, and Jack followed, knowing that every step could be his last. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the tension between the three tribes thickened, the land itself a silent witness to the ancient dance of survival and power. Jack's heart thundered in his chest, each beat a reminder that he was running out of time. The Apaches were close, their presence like a shadow pressing down on him. And the Comanches, well, they were somewhere, circling, waiting. Jack didn't know how much longer he could keep running. His muscles screamed in protest, his lungs burned with each shallow breath. But stopping wasn't an option. Not now. Not when the stakes were this high. Aki led them through the trees, his movements smooth and calculated, his every step precise. Jack could feel the weight of the man's calm, the steady rhythm of his steps in contrast to the chaos of their situation. The deeper they went, the more the wilderness seemed to shift around them, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. The forest closed in, the canopy above growing thicker, suffocating almost. Jack's vision blurred at the edges as his eyes darted between the trees. Every step felt like they were sinking deeper into the heart of something alive, something that had been waiting for them all along. "Stay close," Aki murmured, his voice low, but sharp with urgency. Jack didn't need to be told twice. They had to keep moving, but the woods, wild, untamed, felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. The landscape was a labyrinth, a place where you could lose yourself as easily as you could die. And it wasn't just the forest. It was the tribes, the relentless warriors, who knew every inch of this land, every tree, every stone. The stakes had never been higher, and yet Jack felt himself slowing, his mind clouded by fatigue and fear. Suddenly, Aki stopped, his hand shooting out, holding Jack in place. Jack's pulse spiked as he dropped into a crouch, rifle raised, eyes scanning the shadows. Aki didn't move. He was still as death, his gaze locked on something ahead. Jack followed his stare, his breath catching in his throat when he saw them. Two figures emerged from the trees, cloaked in fur and shadow. Apaches. Silent as ghosts, their eyes gleaming with predatory intent. They were close, too close. Jack's hand tightened around the rifle, but Aki's fingers brushed his arm, a quiet warning. Jack's instinct screamed at him to act, to fight, to shoot. But Aki was still, watching, waiting. "They're not alone," Aki whispered, barely audible above the wind. Aki's eyes flicked to the left, toward a narrow passage between the trees. Jack followed his gaze and saw it, the flash of movement, more shadows, more warriors. A trap. The Apaches had found them. and the Comanches were closing in from the other side. They were surrounded. No way out. Jack's breath quickened, his heart pounding as his mind raced through every possible scenario. They couldn't fight them all. The odds were too great. But there was no choice. They had no time to think, no time to strategize. The fight was happening now. Aki raised his hand, signaling Jack to stay low. He didn't speak, but his actions were clear, silent, deadly. The fight was about to begin. Aki drew an arrow from his quiver, knocking it with a fluid movement that seemed as natural as breathing. Jack's fingers twitched around his rifle. He wasn't an expert shot, but he'd been in enough scrapes to know how to kill a man if the need arose. His eyes scanned the Apaches as they drew closer. The tension was unbearable, each second stretching into eternity, the air thick with the smell of pine and the anticipation of violence. And then Aki moved. The first Apache warrior barely had time to react before Aki's arrow found its mark, burying itself deep in his chest. The man staggered back with a grunt, eyes wide in disbelief, before crumpling to the ground. Jack's breath caught in his throat as Aki was already moving again, silent as death itself, pulling another arrow from his quiver, his eyes never leaving the enemy. Jack, heart hammering in his chest, raised his rifle and took aim at the second Apache. His finger tightened on the trigger just as the warrior drew his own bow, and in the instant before the shot could be fired, Jack's bullet punched through the air, striking the Apache square in the chest. The warrior collapsed with a sharp cry, his body hitting the earth with a sickening thud. But the fight wasn't over. The Comanches had closed in. They emerged from the trees like phantoms, their faces painted with terrifying war markings, their eyes full of hate and bloodlust. Their horses moved in a blur, fast as lightning, and they came at them from all sides. Aki stepped back, his eyes flicking to Jack for a split second. Without a word, they both knew what had to be done. They had to fight, had to survive. Jack leveled his rifle, firing into the fray as the Comanches charged. The first Comanche dropped from his horse, an arrow lodged in his throat, his body twisting in the air before crashing to the ground. Aki was already moving, his bow a blur as he loosed arrows into the chaos. Jack fired again, his shot true, and another warrior fell, but the numbers were overwhelming. The ground shook beneath their feet as the Comanches surged forward, arrows flying, swords clashing. Jack fired again, hitting one of the warriors in the chest, but it wasn't enough. They kept coming. The weight of it pressed on him, the adrenaline flooding his veins, drowning out everything except the fight, the need to survive. Aki moved like a shadow, his arrows finding their marks, his eyes focused on the enemy with an intensity that was almost inhuman. But Jack could see the strain in his movements, the way his shoulders hunched with the weight of each shot. They were outnumbered. They were exhausted. And yet they fought on. Jack's rifle clicked empty. He threw it aside without thinking, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. He met the next warrior head-on, blocking the Comanche's blow with a grunt as he drove the knife into the man's side. The warrior howled in pain, but Jack didn't wait to see the result. He pulled the knife free and spun, his eyes darting for his next target. The battle raged around them, a whirlwind of blood and chaos. Jack's vision blurred with the strain, his body moving on instinct, his actions a blur of desperate survival. The warriors, however fierce, were not invincible, and one by one, they began to fall. Then came the final Comanche, the leader. He rode in with the fury of a storm, his horse charging through the battlefield like a force of nature. His eyes locked on Aki, and with a war cry, he rode straight for him, blade raised high. Aki barely had time to react as the Comanche leader swung a sword, but before the blade could reach him, Jack lunged forward, tackling the leader off his horse. The world became a blur of fists and fury. Jack felt the sting of the Comanche's blade cut across his side, felt the weight of the warrior pressing down on him. But his own hands were relentless, the grip on his knife unwavering, as he drove it deep into the warrior's ribs. The battle ceased in an instant. The forest fell quiet, the wind howling through the trees like a mournful song. The ground was littered with the bodies of the dead, and in the middle of it all, Jack and Aki stood, bloodied but alive. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he looked at Aki. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The fight was over. They had survived. For now. But Jack knew, deep down, that survival was only the beginning. The land would never forget what they had done here. The tribes would never forget. And neither would he.